What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the table. This episode is supported by MK Army Heal Energy, a founding partner of the Roundtable for Men, built for long days and real work. Fuel the fearless. Now, last episode, we talked about how two people can have the same experience in completely different emotional realities. How two people can live through the same reality and still look at it through a different lens. When emotions impact the direction a conversation goes, and how at the end of the day, these conversations lead to one party feeling unheard and invalidated. So that's what we're going to talk about today: feeling unheard, the emotional misunderstandings, the communication breakdowns, constantly being forced to repeat yourself emotionally, the people you love most making you feel unseen and unwanted, the pure emotional exhaustion that comes from continuing to fight for what you feel is done for you. This all leads to you shutting down, avoiding problems, and carrying everything silently, when all you really want is emotional acknowledgement, and in some cases, an apology from the people that hurt you. Sometimes people don't stop communicating because they have nothing left to say. Sometimes they stop because they no longer believe they'll actually be understood. So that's what we're talking about today: feeling unheard by the people that matter to us most. So come on in, get comfortable, and pull up a chair. Most family conflicts blow up because one or both parties immediately go on the defensive. One person is defensive because they feel their actions are justifiable. The other is defensive because they just want to feel understood. And when you're trying to explain what you feel now and what you felt back then, most people don't need everybody to agree with them. They just want to feel heard. These situations begin to create emotional frustration. It makes you feel emotionally dismissed and abandoned. You want acknowledgement, but instead you have to keep repeating yourself. When you look at each separate situation, you have people misunderstanding the tone and intention of the message. You become frustrated because people begin assuming your intentions incorrectly. When you're fighting with family members and they try to minimize your personal experience, as time passes, the pressure builds, the resentment builds, the anger builds, until eventually everything boils over. Then, because emotions are high, both parties lash out, when the reality is you're just trying to communicate calmly while still feeling misunderstood. There's a huge difference between somebody hearing your words and somebody actually understanding what you're trying to say. This is where things get nasty, because now the conversations aren't about actually having a conversation, they're about listening just to respond. It's not about healing, it's about proving who's right. Both sides become emotionally defensive. People start making assumptions. They start interrupting each other. They both begin invalidating each other. Every single interaction, every single conversation turns into a battle. A lot of conversations stop being productive once both people start protecting themselves instead of trying to understand each other. So many conversations turn into arguments because people immediately go into self defense mode. And when that happens, one or even both sides end up putting up emotional walls. In each one of these conversations, someone misunderstands emotional honesty for criticism. That's when people begin reacting instead of listening, and that creates friction between both parties. Now, here's the thing: people become emotionally defensive because of the pain they've been through, either as a child or even the things that they're going through currently as an adult. And that pain doesn't just stay in the past, that pain follows you throughout life. That pain is carried in how you carry yourself, how you think, how you make decisions, and even in how you communicate. In my experience, that pain will cause people to either say things they don't really mean or just shut down completely. It causes both parties to bring their egos into the conversation. The person who is more emotionally involved begins to develop fear. a fear of being blamed for the arguments, a fear of being shamed for feeling the way they feel, which it causes emotional conversations to escalate quickly. And here's the kicker: sometimes people aren't actually arguing about the situation anymore. They're arguing about whose emotional experience is more valid. And neither person is wrong for feeling the way they do. Both experiences are valid. But sometimes people need that validation. Sometimes people need an apology. But one thing's for sure: everyone deserves understanding. Now let's get into what feeling unheard does to people. The more these conversations happen, the more people shoot each other down, the more that the resentment begins to build, the more frustrated people become with each other. These fights cause people to become emotionally isolated. The isolation creates an anger that, in some cases, feels unexplainable. The anger comes from years of being dismissed, years of being ignored, years of being told that, as men, our feelings don't matter, years of the people who matter most to you making you feel insignificant, making you feel unloved, making you feel like things you have to say never truly mattered. And all of this eventually leads to one person becoming extremely sad. After carrying these issues for a long period of time, you become emotionally exhausted. You begin to shut down emotionally, and that creates an extreme loneliness. That loneliness is heavy on anyone who carries it. And as men, we often feel like we carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. So that loneliness makes things even heavier. Eventually, this causes some men to stop explaining themselves because they stop believing that it matters. When people begin getting emotional during arguments, people start acting differently. Some people get louder and more vocal. Some people, like myself, get quiet and completely shut down. When we fight with our loved ones and feel like we aren't being heard, we begin emotionally detaching from those people, which makes it easier to eventually cut people off completely. For a majority of us, we begin internalizing that pain because that's what we were taught and what was modeled by our fathers. But it's also what society expects from men. So we continue through everyday life situation. So we continue through everyday life carrying our frustrations silently. And eventually, because we fight so much over the same topics, we lose the emotional energy to keep going. We stop putting effort into trying to be heard. A lot of people don't understand the emotional burnout that comes from feeling unheard. Every time we try to be heard and leave the conversation still feeling unheard, we slowly begin feeling like we should stop trying to be understood altogether, which leads to people emotionally withdrawing from relationships. We begin bottling up our emotions. And as men, we already tend to do that because we get told to man up or figure it the fuck out ourselves, which ultimately leads to resentment building silently over time. And sometimes the loudest reactions come from people who spent a long time feeling unheard quietly. All of this leads to changes in people's relationships. And a majority of the time, those changes aren't positive. It leads to emotional distance because eventually people become exhausted from having to explain themselves over and over again on the same subject. Eventually, that leads to unresolved resentment because at some point, there's a breakdown in communication. And that lack of communication leads to resentment because the people you love have made you feel like you've been treated unfairly or like your personal boundaries have continuously been crossed, which leads to avoiding important conversations. And that creates a disconnect between both people because one person wants emotional understanding and the other person wants their perspective acknowledged. And that causes relationships to fade. The bonds crumble. And this doesn't just happen between family members, it happens in all types of relationships. And after enough of that happens, your emotional safety with certain people disappears. And the reality is, sometimes relationships don't end because people hate each other. Sometimes they end because both people stopped feeling understood. And it affects all kinds of relationships. It causes friendships to drift apart, not just those casual friendships. Friendships that lasted for decades splinter and fall apart. Then there's family tension built through years and years of neglect and fighting. It even happens in romantic relationships, causing emotional disconnect that eventually leads to the relationship falling apart completely. The more these things continue to happen, the more people begin avoiding difficult conversations. The conversations that really need to happen. It makes you feel like you have to emotionally walk on eggshells around certain people. So eventually you do what feels easiest and you shut down entirely. And what happens before communication shutdowns completely is that the emotional trust breaks down first. People begin avoiding emotions altogether. And that unresolved pain creates distance between people. Because eventually we get tired of trying to communicate people with people just to end up feeling unheard. Then communication becomes transactional instead of emotional. And communication no longer fully translates the message you're trying to convey. So you end up sticking to the basic responses, the I love you twos, the good nights, the basic of basic. And after all of that, what people don't realize is the cycle continues. Even after making the decision to cut someone off, the entire experience lingers with you. And it causes you to develop defensive communication patterns. Even when you finally close that chapter of your life, the emotional defensiveness remains. Every time a conversation becomes emotional, you expect immediate misunderstanding from the opposite party, even when the person you're talking to has no intention of fighting. You become emotionally guarded. Every conversation, you put your guard up immediately. You try protecting yourself from ever being put in that position again. And while trying to protect yourself, you're projecting pain. And people notice it. They see it in how you carry yourself, how you talk about yourself, and how you approach relationships. And eventually, you start struggling to hear others too. That's when the unhealthy patterns begin repeating themselves. You start doing some of the same things the people cut you off once did. Pain that never gets processed usually gets projected somewhere else. You become emotionally reactive during arguments and even during smaller discussions. You automatically assume negative intent, which means you start shutting down quicker because there's that voice in the back of your head saying, they're just going to do the same thing again. What's the point of talking? And that voice paralyzes you to the point where anytime you have an emotional conversation, you stop fully engaging with the person in front of you. You stop listening to understand and start listening just to respond, which causes you to trust conversations less. You begin using emotional self protection as a survival mechanism. All of this eventually leads to unresolved emotional wounds. And those emotional wounds cause people to unintentionally recreate the same cycles that they hate. You begin developing a fear of vulnerability after repeated misunderstandings. And because no one seems willing to truly understand your point of view, you convince yourself that your reactions are justified, that you're protecting yourself from further pain while simu- by hurting the other people around you at the same time. So eventually, you have to make the conscious decision to break the cycle yourself. When you finally decide to break the cycle, You have to take the time to look inward and address your weaknesses. If you're someone who listens just to respond, you have to intentionally learn how to listen to understand instead of emotionally reacting to every word. You've got to slow yourself down and really listen to what the other person is trying to say. You need to walk into conversations with emotional awareness and a willingness to slow down your reactions. Conversations are meant for communication, not for trying to win. When possible, important conversations should happen in person only and never over text. Because emotions rarely translate properly through text messages. You have to be willing to ask questions so you can truly understand the other person's perspective. You also have to be willing to take accountability for your own actions and inactions. Something that I want to make clear is this. Understanding someone doesn't always mean agreeing with them. These conversations require emotional maturity, the kind of maturity that allows you to regulate your emotions instead of shutting down when things become uncomfortable. It means being able to validate someone else's feelings without surrendering your own. That requires putting aside your ego, your need to win, and your need to always be right, and instead truly listening to understand. While doing these things, you'll eventually begin creating healthier communication habits and more emotional honesty within yourself. But that requires effort from both people because a conversation stops being productive the moment understanding becomes less important than being right. If any part of this episode connected with you, take something from it. Start paying closer attention to your conversations with friends and with family because nobody wants to live through emotional loneliness. We all need that human connection. We all deserve to be heard, understood, and validated for how we feel. There will always be misunderstandings, but it's our responsibility to ask questions so that both people don't end up emotionally exhausted from constantly misunderstanding each other. Because the reality is, everyone wants to feel seen, everyone wants to feel heard. And sometimes the deepest loneliness people experience happens while sitting directly across from someone they care about. So the next time you feel unheard, remember what we talked about today. Put your ego aside, take a breath, and truly listen to what's being said to you. And if you're the one speaking, make sure you aren't speaking just to win. Thanks for sitting down with me today. I'll see you next time on the Roundtable for Men.